Hi, everybody.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. How are you, Greg?
Doing good. Enjoying the sunshine here today.
Wow, that's nice.
Hello, everyone. Hope some of you got to listen into the Attestation 6 webinar that just ended.
Dave, what's the comment? So I missed that.
The CCC webinar for the past hour that just finished was about attestation, and this meeting was plugged, and so I'm hoping that we'll pick up anybody else that, whether this meeting or the next occurrence this meeting that was at that webinar. I know we have a couple people on here right now that were part of that, at least whether as a panelist or as a attendee. And so I'm hoping we'll see some new folks because we plugged it a number of times, or I should say Lily plugged it a number of times. So this meeting series.
So we're still waiting for more people to join. If you guys can put your, fill up the attendee list, that'd be good. I think we have waited for long enough, and we got the long list of attendees today. And so as you can see in the minutes document, today we have a one main agenda. It's a discussion by Greg on the IT in the Azure Attestation service. Before that, we'd like to briefly check in on the secure channel track. For that track, we got 2 action items or updates, from Dan and Case. So you guys got any updates?
Yeah, so I checked around for the Intel stakeholders that have been involved with some of the TLS implementations. So Graham, RATS TLS implementation, a couple of the others. I'd say that there's mixed interest in moving forward with something that might be unified, and kind of looking for whether or not there's interest from the rest of the community to make something that's unified there.
Yeah, from my point of view, and after our last meeting, I went out of town for 3 weeks, so I haven't had a chance to track down much, but I do know there's interest on our side to do that. So I think that that we should probably, we should maybe talk offline and see how we can kick that off.
Sounds good.
Dan, would it help if you guys had a crisp definition of the extension in terms of OID and structure from an internet draft, for example?
Yeah, I think just about any more specificity anybody wants to bring to the conversation would be helpful. I think that there's always going to be a little bit of a trade-off for people in that if they already have an implementation, they already have that feature, and so moving to something that's more unified is a benefit to them over the long term from maintenance and security. So it also sort of trades off against the customizations that they've taken in order to fill the specific needs for what might be an OE or other platforms. So
okay,
I mean,
thank
I would still find it useful. I don't know if others would, because we've talked about, what should the SIG do, right? If there was actually a written maybe survey of the different approaches, but what are the trade-offs, right? I mean, has anyone done analysis that says, well, out of the 6 or 7 different variations we have, right? Which ones could be combinable because they really provide the same promises versus which ones are trading off for different things, right? And so I don't have a good view of that right now, just because it's all kind of scattered around. I didn't try to organize it in my head, and I would love it if the SIG had something like that says, okay, well, here are the different trade-offs between these classes of approach, and how many different classes of approach are there right now. I think in a previous meeting I stated I don't believe that there's a one-size-fits-all solution. There might be 2 or there might be 3 different variations, but there's probably not 1. And I'm hoping there's not 7, right? And so what's the right number? What are the different trade-offs? I think I would find that personally, I would love to read a document that talks about that. So
Dave, I had tried when we had the discussion to create a sort of taxonomy.
I agree. That was the closest thing. It was a great slide deck. Yes.
So building on top of that would be, or
Yes.
starting from there. Okay, I will.
Yes. Use that as that was an excellent starting point. I agree.
Okay, cool.
In fact, that was the presentation that made me want this. Just says, now I know what I want. Before that, I didn't know what I wanted. So,
Okay.
So then what is the next step for that?
Or drafting some sort of document that I will possibly put onto our GitHub org.
Oh, okay.
And-
So Tomas, you'll be taking that to the next step, is what I mean.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
and this
Thank
gets into the question, because in the notes and stuff, we talk about unified TLS, right? What does unified mean, right? Because if there's no one size fits all, what does unified mean? Does it just mean that across the 7 or so, couple of them get unified into one of the 2 or one of the 3, in which case there's multiple unified? That's quite possible. I don't know. But when we start filling out the term unified TLS, I don't know what that means yet. So that's why I asked that question.
But Dave, you're making the assertion that you don't think there's one. Actually, from what I have seen, I think there is. We could pull off one where you specify like a lot of the implementations, or at least RATLS that we started was very focused on SGX, right? So it's we only send the SGX code, and I believe some other implementations have done better abstraction. And I think in the end, you probably, I don't know the answer, I'm not 100% sure, but I am leaning more towards that it's possible to have that one if you define that abstraction correctly, and that one implementation. But yeah, it may come at a cost. I don't know. Yeah,
I would encourage you to take that position, see how far we can go. That would be lovely. So for example, I don't think the SGX quote format is the ideal thing to optimize for,
Yes,
right?
that-
But that's
that
the
I-
current thing, right? Things that are, say, what you optimize for if you have a dice-based implementation, say based on ARM Trust Zone, might be very different from what you're doing with SGX quotes right now.
that I already know. That SGX code is not the, I'm not saying promoting that we should.
So that's what I said.
Yes.
If you think that you can get something that would work for, Intel processors and ARM processors and RISC-V processors and AMD processors, and be optimal for cases that you have to have protocols that pass X509 certs, and also for protocols that have to pass, say, Seaborg web tokens. Please feel free to attempt that. I'm not optimistic that you can get down to one, because if your optimal format has to be a CWT and you don't have the space for doing a certificate, then you might need a different solution. And so that's why I'm having a little bit of skeptical, but I encourage you to proceed down there. I would love you to be right. So
Actually, I would see that some that you mentioned about DICE, right? I would see DICE as one variation of ITLS, right? So to me, ITLS is just you have an X519 cert, and then you put an extension, you have an evidence there, right? So, but DICE, you see the whole bunch of already extensions which are for evidence. So and if you look at the very different implementation of the current ITLS, right? So we have the original ITLS, we have the OESDK, and then the majority of the implementation is on the creating a cert and then verifying, creating a cert with the evidence and verifying the evidence, right, in the cert. Basically, is focusing on how to create the evidence and how to verify the evidence. Other than that, it's a very thin layer built on top of the existing like TLS packages, like embedded TLS or OpenSSL, right? So I don't
I'm just thinking about the presentation that Hannes gave within this one here, which was about the use of TLS without certificates. And in particular, if you say you're going to centralize one around X509, I'm not ready to yet believe that that's a one-size-fits-all, that everything can use certificates, right? He explained that the IETF is looking at ways of doing TLS without certificates for constrained devices. And so if you say we're going to have a unified X509 one, it's not going to be unified across all of them, is my current hypothesis, just based on that discussion.
So that's the TLS, this one TLS plus the CWT. So do you see that as like TLS without certificate?
Hannes explained that is work in the TLS working group right now, is TLS without public keys, for example.
Yeah.
And so, yes, whether it's TLS and DTLS, which is part of the same working group, right? Just, TLS, the datagram version we used with UDP, which might show up, and maybe you know this, Keith, which one Quick uses. Does that use DTLS or TLS, since Quick is UDP at the bottom and not TCP at the bottom? I don't know, but the point is you'd want TLS with Quick, and I'm sure there's an answer already. And I don't know if that one is tied to certificates. I suspect it is right now, but my point is for constrained devices, and since we want confidential computing with all devices, right, and attestation with all devices, then I'm not yet ready to believe that certificates will be used in all possible cases. So,
yeah, Dave,
it'll
with
be
that
used for
statement,
scalability.
I was definitely assuming TLS with certificates. With that, and I wasn't familiar with the work that you just mentioned. Yes, then it's
and I wasn't either until Hannes presented it. So,
and I would just say there are two parts though, right? One is around the format of the evidence and all of that, and the other one is, do we actually even go after defining a standard or extending the TLS? Because right now we're just using the cert extensions, whatever, but even actually influencing the TLS protocol to put whatever in that evidence, so that those two are completely separate. We could, right? That is, and I'm not sure if this SIG is looking at both of those. And let's assume TLS with certificates, and can we actually standardize what what cert extensions we use versus everybody's just picking whatever they feel comfortable, and then the format of the code or whatever the evidence that goes in there. So I would say those are two separate things. And yes, if there's TLS without certs, then we have to then there'll be at least two then implementations. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the wins that I would be looking for is if we've got 7 different secure connection protocols and 4 of them are mostly the same thing, and we've got 4 groups of developers that are doing redundant work, if we had a project that unified those efforts, so we didn't necessarily get to like the one protocol for everybody, but we got to a good use of having this open source consortium that we have together, that people are getting benefit out of a project that brings together a lot of otherwise redundant efforts, that would be a win.
Yeah, 100%. I think we need to be mindful. Like we kind of had stalled out in this SIG for a while when we tried to take a look at all use cases, and we were kind of reframing things to be a bit more pragmatic and focused. And I think if we just come out of get some low-hanging fruit out of the way and say that these 4 things or these 3 things can be consolidated, then that's a huge first step.
So as a next step, do we have, did we mention Thomas will like start some documentation or?
Yeah, so it sounded like Thomas was volunteering to do some additional analysis. I'll reach out to Keith and others that have implementations and try to figure out where the people's heads are at before the next meeting.
Okay, so Dan, you will have the action item to reach out to the community.
Yeah, unless I can trick you into doing it.
So any other comments, questions? If not, then we're gonna switch to the main topic for the day. And Greg, you can take over.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me get my screen sharing going here. And so from a mechanical perspective, please feel free to ask questions anytime. Interrupts are welcome. And I'm going to do my best to try to watch for any raised hands or for comments in the chat, but no guarantees I can actually stay on top of that. So first of all, thanks for letting me share about the Azure attestation service and how we use the EAT format in our service. So I intend to go through a handful of topics here, give an overview of the service for those of you who haven't been exposed to it before, talk a bit about registered and unregistered claim names that we use. We like to think about claims in terms of where is its source? Is it coming from the service? Is it coming from attestation evidence or some other location? So I'll kind of talk about our claim names from that perspective. Also talk briefly about some challenges that we've had kind of running our service and evolving claim names over time, and briefly talk about what's next. So first of all, I want to give a shout out to Mark Novak, who's I think is on the call. Yes, there he is. He's one of the original creators of the attestation service. I joined a year or 2 after it started. So I'm going to make sure I'm going to route all the really hard questions to him.
Gee,
so
thanks. Then maybe you want to give me a GitHub access too.
Yeah. So anyhow, Microsoft Azure Attestation Service is an attestation service run in Azure. It went GA about 1.5 years ago in January of 2021. And it's a multi-tenant attestation or verification service. So there is kind of one special, I shouldn't say special, but Microsoft, we operate essentially an instance of the service that's available for anybody to use with a very simple default policy. But any Azure customer, and when I say policy, I mean appraisal policy. But any Azure customer that wants to, if they have their own specific appraisal policy that they want to apply, or they want the verification service to honor, they can do that by creating their own instance of this multi-tenant service and then specifying their policy, and that'll end up with a unique DNS name, and they can essentially route verification requests to that DNS name and get results reflecting their appraisal policy. We're kind of a platform supporting a growing number of attestation types, and I say and scenarios. So the different attestation types that we have going at the moment: SGX, FSMP, TPM, so virtualization based secure enclaves, VPS enclaves. Azure has some features that are built based on attestation that's implemented in MAA. We have something known as trusted launch of virtual machines, where the initial software running on the machine is attested to by MAA, and there's alerting based on whether that's happened or not is one feature built on it. Another is confidential virtual machines built on SMP, which ensures that the confidential virtual machine running on SMP meets the criteria that's expected to be confidential. The last bullet item on here is, so we are an attestation service that verifies attestation evidence, but we also and some of that attestation evidence can be for trusted execution environments like SGX or SMP. We choose to run our service inside of a trusted execution environment itself. Currently, the technology is SGX, but that's something that could and probably will change over time as the technologies evolve. And that's kind of provable in that we make that attestation evidence for our service in its TEE available for for users of the service to see and then to verify on their own. So folks are probably familiar with this diagram, the RETS architecture diagram, and MAA is a verifier, like we see in the center there. And at a very high level, we take native attestation evidence formats as input. And then as an output, we always emit an EAT JWT token. We don't do the CWT or CBOR stuff. We are strictly JSON and JWTs. Then there's a few, when I look at this diagram, there's a few ways that that the service kind of grows the picture a bit. And so on the bottom left side, as I talked about, we support, it's not just a single type of attestation that's supported, it's multiple, and it grows over time. On the top left, in terms of kind of endorsements, not only conceptually are there, manufacturer endorsements in there about the TE technology like AMD or Intel or what have you, but because we are a cloud service, we are part of a cloud service provider in Azure, there are some endorsements that we can put into JOTS where appropriate that are essentially endorsements from the Azure CSP kind of itself. And the top right-hand side, as I talked about earlier, there's not just one there's just not one appraisal policy for evidence. This is a multi-tenant service, and conceptually there is lots of verifier owners and they each have their own appraisal policy. So I'm going to try to go through this one quickly. This is the kind of a high-level design diagram, architecture diagram for a running instance of the MAA service. And on the left side, we see the native attestation evidence comes in. On the right side, we see the EAT JWT token coming out. And on the bottom, we see that essentially the verification owner has the ability to define the appraisal policy. And the authorization for that is done either via user authentication, Azure Active Directory, or for folks, that are very, security conscious and want to take on the responsibilities of managing keys, they can essentially authorize editing of the appraisal policy by signing those changes with a key that they manage on their side. So if we look at the flow through the service, when a request comes in on the left, it hits a REST endpoint. and that native attestation evidence is taken off the wire. And then we transition into, in the red dotted lines, a part of the service that's secured by the TEE technology. So the REST endpoint itself is not, but very quickly, all of the actual authorization decisions happen inside of this TEE protected environment, SGX in our case. So the first step is the evidence trusted per the endorsements from the manufacturer. If that the answer is yes, then the native attestation evidence is transformed internally into a collection of claims called a claim set, and then it's passed into a policy engine that knows how to interpret the policy, the appraisal policy that users can define. And there's two steps to what happens in the policy engine. The first step is this attestation, should the token be issued at all? Is this an authorized circumstance? And if that passes, if the jot token should be created, then the second step is the ability to essentially control the particular claims. We can filter some claims out, or we can add, I call it derived claims. And the jot itself is signed by a key, the little red key in the bottom right, and that's a key that never leaves the secured enclave environment. Here's an example of what policy may look like. So there's a section for authorization rules and a section for issuance rules. And in this particular example, the authorization rule says, only issue a JWT if the signer for this SGX enclave is a well-known signer key. And then in the issuance rule, it's basically saying I want to emit a claim called current version and set a value of true or false. And that's based on whether the MR enclave hash value of the code that's running in the enclave matches a particular hash value. So just a hypothetical example there. So the interesting thing that policy language and the flexibility of it allows is that, back to the RATS diagram, the RATS architecture diagram, the appraisal policy for attestation results, the decision making that's happening in the relying party, some of that, all of that could be moved into the MAA service itself by combining it into essential appraisal policy for evidence that the verified owner can plug into the service. So then the relying party could have a simple authorization like, did I get a jot from the appropriate issuer, and is it signed correctly? Or did I get a jot from the appropriate issuer, and does it have like one simple claim like, trusted by my company equals true? It's out there that can be done, and we're kind of in the early stages of this kind of whole space. So we'll kind of see over time what relying parties end up doing.
Question on that? I don't know if you want questions now.
Oh yeah, please do.
So on the in the RATS diagram about the appraisal policy for attestation results, that point is really about the relying party looking at the attestation results and deciding whether it trusts the verifier, right? Because you talked about the verifier is provably running an SGX, okay? And so the relying party's appraisal policy might be prove that you're running an SGX. And so you said you could offload that into the verifier. And can you say more? Is that possible? How would the relying party rely on the verifier to say that the verifier is running an SGX? Because it seems like that's something that has to be done by the relying party.
No, you're totally right. So it's, I guess if I were to redraw this diagram, and what you're, when I think of the first example that comes to my mind when I think of appraisal policy for attestation results is the relying party is saying something like, okay, I've got these, it's not that I am, and maybe I'm misunderstanding this term.
No, I think there's two different uses, and I think you answered my question, right? Because it's really the appraisal policy for attestation results, you can say the relying party at the end of the day is probably trying to make an authorization decision, right? That's not the
Yes.
only case, but that's the most common case of attestation, right? So the authorization decision is saying, given the attestation results, are they actually authorized or not? So I have to make some decision based on the claim set or whatever in the attestation results. And that decision, you might think of as being appraisal policy, at least for some aspects of that authorization decision, right? Does it come from a verifier that I trust? Does that verifier look like it's up to date? If so, then yeah, I'll trust that. And then I'll go against, whatever ACLs or policy that I have because it's authenticated, it's attested, and so on. So all of that appraisal policy is at least everything except for maybe the authentication ACL part that says, is the identity allowed to use? So you could argue that that's not part of attestation. But that was really what appraisal policy for attestation results was designed to do. So I think you've answered my question. So you're welcome to go on. So thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I probably missed. I didn't. That term, as you point out, is probably defined to mean exactly what you said, and not how I was thinking of it, which was that authorization decision that relying parties are making.
And it's also possible that the RETS architecture document could be better worded. And that's kind of why I'm asking some clarifying questions here. So
yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So I saw Sean Wei had a question in the chat.
Oh, what script language? So the script language. So my understanding is that Microsoft had I presume they still have. I don't know if they still, but they have a directory service called Active Directory, and it can run on-prem, and then there's one on the cloud called Azure Active Directory. And for the one on-prem, certainly like in the 2012, 2010, 2014 timeframe, there was an extension to that called ADFS, Active Directory Federation Service. And that had a language in it to basically control the claims that went into the JOT token for federation scenarios for identity across companies. And this language, my understanding, is essentially an evolution of what was used in that product. But that's, that's I don't have firsthand knowledge of that. That is something I heard, somebody describe to me. All right. And I do see we have Sundari on the call, who's also on the MAA team. So Sundari, if you know better there, please feel free to jump in.
Hey all, yeah, this is Sindhuri, PM for Microsoft Azure Attestation. What Greg has said is right. So we also have published the claim rule grammar on Microsoft public documentation. I'm posting the link that could help in drafting custom policies.
Thanks, Sindhuri.
Thank you. That should be interesting.
Thank you.
Since that question was raised, I think over in Tomas and Simon's project, you're using, was it Open Policy Agent, which I think is JSON based. Does that sound right?
The acronym OPA, I believe I saw in Verizon.
Yeah, Verizon uses OPA is
That's
the
correct,
Open Enclave Open Policy Agent. That language is called Rego script.
Yep.
So I have a question regarding this verifier thing. If you go to the next slide, please, where you showed different verifiers, and I was wondering that is that an assumption that you have the relying party basically trusts all these verifiers, right? Is that an assumption, or how do you build?
No. Great question. So basically, every verifier has a unique DNS name. And when a relying party basically trusts the verifier, it identifies the verifier with the DNS name. So, basically, if the relying party wants to trust multiple verifiers, they'd have to configure to trust multiple DNS names, which reflect multiple, independent policies. Is that making any sense?
So does that mean that basically there is a trust building process which happens before for all these verifiers, whichever you have for all the existing verifiers, right?
Now, a relying party basically chooses to, in a relying party must choose to trust a verifier, right? And how does it express that it trusts a verifier? For MAA, it trusts a verifier by saying, I trust the verifier with this REST endpoint, https:// myverifierName.com. That's what I trust, and that my JWT better reflect that it came from that DNS name.
Okay, that is assumed to be pre-known, that it's correctly known to the relying party exactly which
The
DNS.
relying party, yes, the relying party
Okay.
must know. And as I said at the beginning, there's two types of. If I go back to this slide here, so there's a simple and there's a more complex. So Microsoft operates essentially if the verifier doesn't need any custom policy. If the relying party doesn't need any custom policy, if they're just saying, I want to get the verification service to ensure that the attestation evidence for SEV-SNP or SGX or TPM is trusted, respected. I want them to ensure that it meets the manufacturer's endorsements, and then just give me the attributes that have been parsed, and then I will make a decision from there. That what I call simple policy is in a kind of globally well-known instance of a verifier that Microsoft runs. If a relying party or a scenario has a need for some specific ad hoc policy, like only trust SGX enclave signed by a particular signer, then they would have to know a very specific, verifier DNS name and program to that or configure to that.
Okay, right, thank you.
Question on the last bullet of the slide you showed, the overview slide.
Yeah.
So you mentioned it's probably runs within SGX. And then how does the relying party verify that it is indeed running a TE?
That's a great question, because it's like the chicken and egg. It's like, so the relying party is the short answer is they have to use they can't use the MAA service to verify. I mean, they could take the attestation evidence that the SGX attestation evidence that MAA provides and send it back to MAA and say, tell me what's in here and whether it's trustable, but that's kind of a circular dependency there. So they have to independently assess that evidence using since it's SGX at the moment, using either like the OE SDK or using the Intel SDK or something like that.
So that means that the MMA does produce an evidence of the TE is using.
Yes.
To the relying party. Okay.
Yeah, so that appraisal policy for attestation results is often a piece of that is verifying the verifier's evidence, right? And it's going to be it's far less complicated than the full verifier, right? I think the full verifier, at least as Greg has talked about it, right? You have to support a bunch of different formats, right? Many different evidence formats, right? Where the relying party only needs a minimal set, right? It doesn't have to support all those other ones. It just needs to be able to verify the fact that that it runs an SGX. So it doesn't care about the TPM one, if the SCV one, or whatever else, right? It doesn't need the complicated thing. It doesn't need complicated policies. It's just the stripped down version, but it still is a minimal verifier inside the relying party, and we call that a verifying relying party in the RATS architecture in one place. So
I'll make two. You're totally right, Dave. Two comments. One is I've seen very little activity in terms of clients actually performing the steps to verify this evidence. Most relying parties most relying parties don't do that. So they don't check that rigorously. The other thing is that we have recently published a sample a standalone sample that uses the OE SDK to basically retrieve and verify, or to validate, uses the OE SDK to validate the SGX quote that MAA returns is essentially part of the JWT, or that can be retrieved by tracking down information from the JWT. So if folks want to do this, we at least have some sample code that's a starting point, or it's actually a tool they can compile and run, or change the code if they want to do this verification. I see Yogesh or
Yeah,
Mohammed both have their hands up.
Yeah, just a simple question. You have on your relying party connected to multiple MAAs. So how do you provision the public keys in the relying party for each of these MAAs in advance? Because you sign the attestation results, right?
You have to. So normally I guess to answer your question is the relying parties trust the piece of information that relying parties start with to trust the attestation results. They don't start with a key. They start with a DNS name from which they can discover a key, from which they can discover attestation evidence that lets them trust that key. So the relying party is given essentially, let me jump ahead here if I can find. Okay, so here's, if you look at like the JWT here and you see this issuer claim, ISS. So essentially that string there, that is what a relying party is configured with to, as far as what it should trust. And from this, it can then basically get to that key, and then they can get to the SGX quote that verifies that key is held by MAA running in this SGX enclave.
Okay.
And the mechanics of how you get to the key is in the JOT, actually in the header, this is the body, but in the JOT header that's not shown, this same string is there, and it's used for the OpenID metadata flow to retrieve trusted signing keys or trusted keys. And when you get the certificate for that trusted key, you get the SGX attestation evidence inside of an OID in there.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Mohammed, did you have a question, or I see your hand raised?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this relying party thing that you mentioned that from your experience, most people do not verify the verifier. And in my view, they are not doing it correctly. I mean, that then you are trusting somebody else, and instead of doing that verification,
I don't disagree with you. I'm merely just sharing. You know, we're all talking about the challenges of doing this very rigorous check of the evidence of the attestation evidence showing that the verification service is running in an enclave. I'm just sharing with you, my observations of relying parties to date. Now, this may be because the space is very immature and is evolving, and over time, folks will catch up, and maybe folks are just experimenting now. I'm just sharing data, but I totally agree with you.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah, and I think you're
Greg.
trying to get MAA to be usable with as many relying parties as possible. Some of them are going to be on the more secure end, some of them may be on the less secure end, but either way, they can trust that MAA is the hoster is out of their trusted computing base, right? That they have control over the policies and things. But ideally, right, we'd want their relying parties to be running inside TEEs themselves, to say, not just take the certificate and the URI that you showed and say, hey, does that chain up to one of the 40 routes that I have for my web browser? And if you're doing that, it's pretty insecure, right? But you can't prevent them from doing that. But you want to make sure that those who are doing it securely can do so simply and efficiently.
All right, thanks, Dave.
So
I'm just
Greg,
curious,
I was just going to say that. So I think sounds like then there is probably a need for, I don't know, a third party service where, because you ultimately, somebody is the root of trust, right? So this verification service is running in an enclave, and a verifier may want to verify that, in which case you who would, yeah, I mean, I guess, is that something maybe in this attestation SIG we need to sort of have a recommendation that, right, like you are providing this service to your customers with this attestation verification service, and oh, by the way, for customers that want to verify, if you, even that verification is running in an enclave, you may need yet another link in that chain, I guess.
Yeah,
The hope is that you don't need
think-
another service. You can get away with another service, but there's no reason that you need another service. Right.
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
all
yeah,
the
that's what I'm
information is
saying.
passed
Whoever-
in the attestation results for it to make a decision locally, because the attestation results could include, the endorsements of the verifier and so on. So the relying party does not need to talk to any other party, right? It needs to have, a set of trust. Like, does it, what's the key that it believes is its own, admin authoritative, source of who's trusted or whatever. And so you got to be provisioned with that, but I don't think that you have to rely on there being somebody else hosting another service, right? You can do that, but I don't see that there's any requirement to do that.
Yeah, I think it's Mona, I think you bring out a reasonable option that folks might consider and might find workable, and that's the way I think of it is an independent party auditing kind of.
Yes,
Maybe audit's the
exactly.
wrong term, but it's like, okay, so it's like, this is too complicated. And so one choice is I do it all myself, but that's very complicated. Another choice is I don't do it. I just kind of trust, that
Yeah.
DNS resolution happened and blah, blah, blah. And the third is, well, I trust some party other than the verification service to verify the verification service. And there's still kind of that bottommost turtle question.
Yeah.
I guess Dave alludes to, if that's a service, then how do you trust that service, right? So, and I guess in my head, there's the frequency at which you validate can be, you can have automated validation or manual validation. So perhaps it's okay to, manually validate, perhaps with a phone call to your auditor, perhaps by having your developer do the manual validation, in their office or something periodically, versus, okay, at runtime, every time you're dealing with these claims, you go through this whole process of validating. And
Yeah.
I think that there's some scenarios that will be fine with periodic manual validation, kind of like an audit kind of thing periodically.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. So it's like, I think you use the right term, some independent third party, like, I don't know, like VeriSign for certs or something. I don't know. Yeah, but I think that piece needs to be there. Otherwise, we'll always have this issue of at least
Maybe
for some. Yeah.
Maybe you and I should start a startup company and provide that service.
All right, thank you.
All right. So getting on to claim names, Thomas framed things pretty well last week when he's talking about some of the things that he offers a number of predefined claims, readily reusable pieces of semantics, and then implementers have choices for how they use these. They can essentially ignore them, or they can only use them, or they can mix. They can use them and add more as necessary. And just like in his case, the MAA case, it's the mix that makes sense. And quite frankly, I think that's always going to be the case. And so in MAA, when we thinking about our claim names, we kind of formulated some principles about how we were trying to approach things and what was important to us. And clearly aligning with EAT, using EAT predefined claim names wherever possible is top of the list. And the next is just kind of reflecting what's in EAT. Well, the first two claim names will be registered with IANA, perhaps defined in the EAT specification, and those will be registered in IANA. And then for us, we kind of chose a prefix of X-MS as our prefix to delineate, claims that we are going to use our private claim namespace. another thing that's important to us, not just the names, but we in our heads think about claims as being associated with different, I'll use the term source. Maybe it's the claim comes from the attestation evidence, maybe it comes from appraisal policy, things like that. So it's important to us that we thought that we knew how to, if you looked at the JOT and looked at any claim, you could figure out what was its source? Was it from appraisal policy or attestation evidence or what have you? And so the tools we use to do that, in some cases, is with a claim name prefix like X-MS-SGX, which is anything that starts with that is claim sourced in the SGX attestation evidence, and or with a I call the claim location. So we have some top level names like X-MS-policy, which everything under there is essentially a claim that's been added by appraisal policy. So those things are important in our heads. That's kind of what led us to where we went. At the moment, this is the set of registered claim names that are used.
Can you say more? What do you mean by added by appraisal policy? Since the attestation result springs into existence after appraisal policy, what does it mean for a claim to not be added by appraisal policy is my question. Is there any claims that are not added by policy?
I guess I would say, I'm talking about essentially derived claims. So if you go back into this example here, you see issuance rules. So essentially, in this part, this is, and maybe I shouldn't be calling this appraisal policy, but this is the
well, I guess my
policy.
question is, you use the term derived claims. Aren't all claims in the attestation results derived? I'm just wondering if you can have different clarification as to what you mean by those terms. So.
All right, so maybe what I mean is if the only reason the claim appears there is because it's been added to the JOT with a statement like this in the MAA policy, then it's what I consider,
I have a guess as to what you mean, but I could be wrong. That's why I was first answering the question, right? There are some claims that are not derived from anything in the evidence. Okay, and an example would be what version of the appraisal policy was used to construct the attestation results, right? The evidence is irrelevant to that. It's the appraisal policy. It's putting in, a hash of the appraisal policy or a version number or whatever it is that identifies, this token was generated against policy version, whatever. Okay, as opposed to things derived from the evidence, but everything is derived in the attestation results, I think, right? It's either derived from evidence or derived from attestation results or derived from a combination of the two. Or perhaps derived from reference values or some other.
And Dave, like from practical perspective, this you are complied with such and such policy as evidence is probably the single most important thing that you can do for like governance and proving compliance.
Yeah. So I'm just asking about derived things. So everything is derived. I think what you mean is derived from evidence versus derived from appraisal policy, meaning without evidence or something else.
So I'm probably. Now I see I'm wrong, and I shouldn't use the term appraisal policy here. So MAA has a policy language. And if in the policy language, you add a claim using the syntax I'm showing on the screen, that's going to go into this bucket that we call X-MS-policy.
Just time check. We have 5 more minutes. I want to
Okay, we should let you finish then. We should let you finish.
Yeah, so I will blast through this then. So registered claim names, and then we have some unregistered claim names, and this is, we prefix, attestation evidence formats to go into an attestation type specific prefix, XS, MS, SEVIS, and PVM, for example. We have at the bottom these top level buckets. I'm going to skip what they mean at the moment. So the MAA service itself has a few claims that it puts in there all the time. We have this XS-MS version, VER, indicating the schema version. We have an claim that defines the attestation type, SGX, SMP, what have you. we capture the policy hash of in the JWT. I'm going to quickly jump ahead here. We've seen the example. So SGX specific claims, no surprises here for folks who know SGX. Ice Lake has some additional claims that are not in Coffee Lake. Here's what it looks like in the JWT. Probably one thing, the most interesting thing here, for this particular attestation type only, because we had a request from one relying party, we actually also include the hash values, which are here in the green rectangle, of essentially the endorsements, the manufacturer endorsements that were used to perform, to arrive to the conclusion that this was verified, trustable and verified. And we had no other request for this information, so it's kind of an oddball in that it's only here, but we're kind of keeping our ears peeled to see if any other relying parties or customers request this in any of the other attestation types, because it can easily be added. SEV-SMP, if you know SEV-SMP, which I don't know in very much detail, but these are all the claims there straight from the evidence. The one interesting thing in this example is this is used primarily for a confidential VM scenario in Azure. And in this case, there's this top level claim that gets added X/MS compliance status, Azure compliant CVM. And kind of conceptually, I think of this as kind of a CSP endorsement, kind of reflected in the token. Dave Thaler you may correct my terminology and nomenclature, but that's how I kind of conceptually think of that. And I can see that over time, that it's likely there'll be more of these kind of claims going or being available to be put into JOT tokens in MAA. And then we come to two interesting buckets, runtime and init time. And so the overall pattern that's happening here is that attestation types that are secure or trusted execution environments typically have ways to associate a small amount of data that's specified at runtime in attestation evidence. And a pattern that's used a lot is to store the hash of a much larger chunk of data in that tiny bit of room, 64 bytes typically, and then have the relying party, interpret that as a hash and stitch it to some data and figure out what, and then and do something with that then trusted data. To make a long story short, what MAA does is it does the mechanics of that end to end. They're assuming that you see here that data is going to contain a SHA-256 hash of the data. And the most interesting thing we do is this slide or here shows that data can be embedded essentially as binary, or if you format it, if that data is actually JSON, then we can put that JSON into the JOT and it meshes naturally. So, and that indeed is kind of what we internally at Microsoft are kind of doing with our relying parties. This is the pattern we're using more and more, which is to, when you want to share any sort of information, perhaps it's keys to establish a secure channel, perhaps it's a nonce value, but you would put it into JSON and essentially have it appear in your JOT token here. There's also this ability to do the same thing for data that's known, that's defined when the secure enclave is launched. In SGX, this is called config ID, and SEV-SMP it's called host data. But the point is, when you launch the enclave, you have the ability to provide a small amount of data for some configuration information. And once again, MAA will do kind of the dance to interpret that as a SHA-256 hash of some data. And in this case, we only support JSON. And because it's got implemented later after we deprecated the binary data. And this is available with Ice Lake and SEV-SMP attestation types. So this can be used for something like, oh, I have an enclave that's going to run, it's running a container, and when that container is launched, when that enclave running the container is launched, the hosting environment provides, mounts 1 or 2 disks to that container, and that could essentially, something like that could be captured as part of these init time claims. So finally, this is the thing we chatted about a bit about the policy claims, and this is what it's an abbreviated JOT, but it shows kind of a bit of all the different types or sources in one JOT token. So, and then finally, this is one challenge that we've hit with evolving our claim names. So we've over time, as the space evolves, we wanted to rename some claim names, and we have. But when we essentially go down the route of saying, let's have a new profile that has the renamed claims, we have some relying parties that operate in the passport model. And essentially what they have said is, no, don't do that to us. And because the moment that you make another profile available for conceptually the same attestation type, perhaps profile 1 and profile 2 for SGX attestation type, now we as a relying party, if we're not immediately up to date with a new profile, which by the way, we don't have time to do, we don't have resources to make changes like this. Customers may be sending us profiles we don't understand. They don't read our documentation telling them don't use these new profiles, and they have failures. We have we have support costs. It'll just be a mess. So what we have done MAA at this point is we essentially support 1 profile per attestation type, and we'll never break it. And so the way that we rename a claim is we duplicate the claim information. So we leave the old claim name in there with the value, and we add the new claim name in with the value. And it's obviously has downside. It's got token bloat going on, but that's where we stand at the moment.
So just time check. Right now we are 3 minutes or 4 minutes. Like over. So I wonder how much you have, content you have. This is a
my
great
last slide here.
presentation, by the way. So,
Thank you.
I think it was
and-
very interesting, and sorry to interrupt. So I suggest that I had few follow-up questions in between, and there were some many interesting aspects. I suggest that we can maybe do it in the next meeting also.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about. Is maybe the next meeting we can allocate some time to follow up discussion for this topic. This is a very interesting, very good presentation, and there are gonna be a lot of questions. Right?
Yeah, I mean that's fine with me. I can start again next meeting, and where I started to go really fast and go through that part again.
Yeah, that would be really helpful to run through a few of the last set of slides which you ran, and then we might have some questions based on that, so we can continue in the next session.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay. So we will have this slide posted there, right? So in the
Yeah, I'll upload them today to the meeting section in GitHub.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. So with that, so do you have additional comments, or we can stop here and then resume next meeting?
I think we're
So-
given we're over time. It's probably better to stop now and just put all the questions in the next one, just because whatever the answers are, there's people that have already dropped off that I'm sure would love to hear it from it. So.
So I think the last item is we need to have a chair for the next meeting. So Yeah, any raising hands for that? So I can, yeah, I can continue to be the chair for the next meeting, and we will have one agenda item at this point, Greg, right? So follow-up presentation discussion, and we can develop additional agenda items in the, yeah, in offline.
Okay,
Okay.
thanks, Sean. Thanks, Greg. Bye-bye.
Sounds good to
Thank
me.
you, Greg. It's a very
Okay,
good
thanks,
presentation.
that's all.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.